Vasili Arkhipov, you probably haven't heard of him, but what he was a part of was one of the most intense events in the Cold War. And if he had acted differently, the world would have most likely become a barren nuclear wasteland. He refused to launch Soviet torpedoes against the units of the USS Randolph, which would have most likely been the catalyst for a nuclear holocaust between the United States and the Soviet Union, resulting in global disaster. This is a story of one man saving the world, a forgotten hero lost to time. To really understand his actions and why they were so significant, we need to go back to 1917 when the hereditary monarchy in Russia was overthrown and taken over by the USSR and the USSR's new form of economy, communism. In 1917, two revolutions swept through Russia, ending centuries of imperial rule and setting into motion political and social changes that would lead to the formation of the Soviet Union. While the two revolutionary events took place within a few short months, social unrest in Russia had been simmering for decades. Communist values against capitalist values set up the events of the Cold War, which was a time after World War II, where there were political debates and skirmishes between the USA and the USSR. This was one of the most dangerous times in human history. If either one of them were to be provoked, they had the power to wipe out a continent with one order. This is why everyone involved in the two parties had to be especially careful.
Arkhipov was born on January 30th, 1926, to a peasant family living in Staraya Kupovna, a town near Moscow, Russia. He enrolled in the Pacific Higher Naval School and later served in the Soviet-Japan War. After World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, the United States and the USSR emerged as the world's major superpowers. In 1961, as a deputy commander, Vasili Arkhipov began working on the submarine K-19, nicknamed Hiroshima for its series of equipment failures. In the same year, across the globe, the CIA organized an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. This was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, which consisted of a small group of Cubans trying to overthrow him and rally citizens. It ultimately failed, as Fidel Castro named this effort American imperialism, and many stood by him. Many of the people in the group of exiled Cubans died, which was a large embarrassment to the U.S. This led to tensions between the capitalist USA and the now communistic Cuba, which was only amplified by the future events of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an event in which the tension between the USSR and the US was high. The cause of the crisis was the Soviet Union stationing missiles in Cuba to get leverage over the US, which had stationed their missiles in Turkey.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
The height of the Cuban Missile Crisis was when Vasili Arkhipov and the crew of the B-59 were off the coast of Cuba. Units of the USS Randolph started to drop depth charges on the sub, and even though there was little risk, the three members that were needed to authorize the launch of a torpedo came together for a decision. The captain, the political officer, and Vasili Arkhipov, the second in command, needed to be present and agree to authorize the launch. Vasili alone withheld his authorization. If a launch were to happen, then the U.S. president at the time, John F. Kennedy, would have considered it an attack on the Western Hemisphere, and he would take action against the USSR. This would have most likely caused a lose-lose situation where both nations are destroyed and the world would have become a nuclear crater. He had single-handedly saved the world from doom. After the B-59's close call, tensions between the bigger players, the US and the USSR, were still high. Eventually, through debate, the USSR publicly agreed to rescind their missiles. However, this came at the price of the US revoking their missiles in Turkey, which they did privately as to ease the minds of Americans. The Cuban Missile Crisis had lasted only a few weeks, but it was the closest we as a human race have ever come to nuclear war. After this, the USSR started to unravel. Their communistic economy was growing poorer, which led to labor strikes. This led to the eventual downfall of the USSR, and eventually the US was declared the victor of the Cold War.
After his diplomatic actions on the B-59, Vasili Arkhipov later went on to be commanding submarines and squadrons. He was promoted to Rear Admiral and became the head of Kirov Naval Academy. He then again got promoted to Vice Admiral. He then retired a few years later and died in 1998 in a small town near Moscow. Eventually, in August of 1963, the US and Russia came to diplomacy and agreed to have a phone that connected from DC to Moscow for easier communication, so something like this would not happen again. Then in 2002, former politicians, leaders, and military personnel came together to discuss what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. They came to the conclusion that Vasili Arkhipov had single-handedly saved the world from a nuclear holocaust. As for relations between the US and Cuba, things have become a lot more diplomatic. Damien Cave from the New York Times wrote about Cuba and when President Obama visited. For decades, Cuba and the United States have framed their relationship as a conflict of opposites. Communism versus capitalism, Cuban loyalists versus Cuban exiles, the state versus the individual. But last week's visit to the island by President Obama, the first by sitting American president since Calvin Coolidge, made it clear that old battle lines are breaking down. All in all, Vasili Arkhipov is indisputably the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis and even the Cold War. If he hadn't withheld his authorization, then thermonuclear war would have most likely broke out. Vasili Arkhipov is the reason the Cuban Missile Crisis did not escalate to a nuclear war, and it came to a diplomatic conclusion.
Alright, let's do this. Vasili Arkhipov. You probably haven't heard of him, but what he did... I'm English. In 1917, two revolutions swept through Europe. Oh my god. For decades. Ow!
The first line. David. Okay.
David.
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 David. Just throw. Just throw Fidel Castro.
Just throw him across. Just throw him across the entirety of Cuba.
Just throw Fidel Castro. The world doesn't become a nuclear holocaust. The Holocaust is an event that happens.
Shut up.
It'll be.
Oh no, Vasili Arkhipov is indisputably the hero of the Cuban Missile Crisis, even the Cold War.
All in.
Thank you for watching our documentary about Vasili Arkhipov! Yo, we did it! Yeah! Ow, again, dude? Come on! For legal reasons, Sergio doesn't hit me.
There was no violence during the production of this documentary.